Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Pielka. Today is November 1, 2022. Welcome to our Finnegans Wake Salon, where we probe the hidden psychic effects of James Joyce and his 1939, I don't know, is it a TikTok or a tweet or an Instagram? It was one of those. I'm really honored to be joined by Richard, Patrick, Sherrie, and Maddy, and more to join us. So let's just start out, folks, by talking about form and content. And
Jerry, Chip says he's backstage, whatever that means.
Oh my God, there he is. That's right. I see. I don't know how to get that up. Oh my God. We're live and I'm blowing it. How do I? Okay, let's see. There we go. And we're joined by
let me in. Nobody's listening.
we're also joined by Roy. So thank you so much. So as I was saying, we're gonna delve right into this question that I'm gonna start us round robin and some thoughts. This comes from Philip K. Dick, a gentleman who Hollywood has made $1 Brazilian off of. He said, I'm going to prove that Finnegans Wake is an information pool based on computer memory systems that didn't exist until centuries after James Joyce's era. That Joyce was plugged into a cosmic consciousness from which he derived the inspiration for his entire corpus of work. So that's Philip K. Dick. And McLuhan said that Finnegans Wake is like our contemporary consciousness of the unconscious. So I think it's interesting how we could discuss what is conscious and what is consciousness. McLuhan says that art could be the collective unconscious and technology could be the collective unconsciousness. And so there's this differentiation. Is there a difference between art and technology? How is that sort of cross over into the realm of discussing Finnegans Wake as form and content? So Robert Creeley, the poet, said, form is never more than an extension of content. So even before we go into conscious and consciousness, let's just discuss Creeley's comment for a second. Form is never more than an extension of content. We'll start with you, Patrick. Any comment?
Yeah, I don't know. It seems sort of facile to me at this point in time. I mean, that's been around for a while. And by the way, it's interesting you say that about the computer, because Jacques Derrida said something very similar way back in the 90s. That Joyce invented a kind of infinite information machine that would go on producing, for infinity, so to speak. And I think there was a lot of truth to that. So
yes,
I think I just will say one thing that I think precisely because Joyce wanted a format that would allow him to do whatever he wanted, that he created what I would call fictional forms. What I mean is that he put out the word that Ulysses was loosely related to the Odyssey, or that Finnegans Wake was loosely related to Vico's theories of history, which really isn't exactly the truth in my view. But it gave, he could make the beginning into the ending in a kind of permanent circle, where the last sentence flows into the first sentence. And that way sort of justify what was almost formless, but had all kinds of forms embedded into it, and so really? He had complete freedom to do whatever he wanted.
Beautiful, Patrick. And so everybody gets the hang of it. You don't have to answer the question. You just jump off and go in any direction you want. So Sherrie, you're up. And Peter, it's great to see you here. We're going off of just this statement in regards to Joyce, consciousness and unconsciousness being compared to form and content. Creeley, form is never more than an extension of content. Go ahead, Sherrie. Any comments?
Well, I know I've kind of mentioned this in the group a couple of times, and it's in our, we have a young group on Monday nights, if anybody's interested, it's fun. And a quote from the book that we've been reading is, etymology is the unconscious side of language, or the unconscious history of language. And I think that's so interesting, because it seems like that's what Joyce is doing with the language, especially in Finnegans Wake, is helping us see, like when we take apart each word, like a word on a page, every word on a page, and we're looking at everything that's in that word, all the different languages and all the different, because each word, most of the words are not real words, but we're finding how they're related to other words in other languages. So we're bringing that etymology into consciousness. And he does kind of make jokes about advertising a lot, and that how advertising uses the language, like they might be selling some makeup to you, but they're using language maybe out of Egyptian myth to appeal to you, but you don't even know where that language came from. But it's hitting something deep in your unconscious mind that goes back centuries to other cultures, and would strike you at a deep level, like, I need to buy that makeup because that's maybe what Egyptian goddesses wore, or something like that. But we don't know, it's not conscious. But
well, Sherrie, you're my hero or heroine. You know, you always nail it so beautifully. McLuhan said that cave art, you know, is the advertising is the cave art of the 20th century. You know, and people want to say they hate advertising. Advertising works, and it's just what symbolism is. It's create the form, you know, create the disease and offer the cure. And I love your explanation of etymology through our Young book. I'm lucky to attend that group. I encourage you all to join Sherrie's Carl Jung group. But my favorite word you used was real words. Like there's a difference between real and unreal. It's like, imagine we're all writing the etymology online, and it's like, you know, these people research where a word came from, but it's still sort of a guessing game. You can, you know, because all my favorite words I look up on etymology are always from back alleys of London. The hoodlums used them. So that's where all the cool words came from. But etymology is a line of bullshit. I love it, but it's really good bullshit that, you know, has made it big and people believe it. So Maddy, it's so good to have you here. Any comment on the Creeley quote or what we're talking about here?
I mean, there were like 5 prompts and quotes that you read at the beginning, and I'm not really sure which direction we're supposed to go in. Speaking of etymology, though, I do want to point out that there are some interesting distinctions between like techne and technique.
Yeah.
Like techne is kind of like the craft of doing something, and it's kind of related to the word for text as well, and also to weaving. We've talked in the Austin group at various points about like text and textuality as being related to like weaving, like as an actual sort of like weaving a narrative, weaving history, and like the interwovenness of all of these stories that happen in the wake. And then the word technique is kind of the root for the word technology, though I think they're related actually. So you asked something you said something in the beginning about like art and technology. Can you reread that quote?
Yeah, no, I will. And Maddy, before I do, tell me how you spelled technique, Techne.
So yes, that's the first one. And then technique would be, I think, Technik, I think.
Nik, yeah. So yeah, this is good because Peter missed this quote. Peter, I'm so glad you're here too. And that is that McLuhan said that he asked the question. He didn't propose a theory. He asked the question, how about art as the collective unconsciousness? And how about technology as the collective unconscious? So this is sort of making a distinction between art and technology in conscious and consciousness.
I don't think you can really neatly divide them, though.
Right.
I mean, art is a way of making visible things that are unconscious or below the surface through various techniques, through various rules, apparatus, like skills, and so on. And technology is kind of that too. It's just applied art in some ways.
It's applied art, but how would you distinguish, Maddy, between conscious and consciousness?
I mean, they're different parts of speech. So that's how I would do that.
That's fine. So then you want to comment on Creeley's quote, form is never more than an extension of content.
I mean, sometimes.
Good. That's fine. So again, these are when I throw out these cute quotes, it's like certain words stand out. Like Patrick was like, he's heard this years ago, and maybe the word never doesn't work. So it's each one of you focusing in. It's user as content, however you want to jump off. So Richard would go. Thank you, Maddy. We'll go to you. Any comment in any of this? Like Maddy put it well, my 5 opening prompts.
Okay, I was trying to think about some of them. What passed through my mind is that, Philip K. Dick definitely took too many drugs. But I think Marshall McLuhan was onto something. And the word that sort of resonated with me most was he used the term archetype. And I've always been intrigued by, everybody has their own approach and angle in looking at Finnegans Wake, either looking at the details or whatever. And I've always been intrigued by the relationship of Joyce's works, including Finnegans Wake, to his own personal life and how he incorporated the use of archetypal themes through his own experiences and then created his art. So I like to see connections and patterns in the works rather than focusing on any one detail. And I think Joyce had his own idea of what art was. He was creating his own art, obviously. And the whole question of form or non-form or new form, I think was relevant to him. And I think he was very much aware of what he was doing. And hey, we're still all talking about it 100 years later.
Dude, that was beautiful. And it is, McLuhan wrote a book called From Cliche to Archetype. And I'm glad you tagged that word on to McLuhan, because I asked Sherrie that yesterday. What did I ask you, Sherrie? What word did Jung come up with? Shadow. Because we know archetype a lot from studying Jung, but he probably got it from someone else. So this is back to love of etymology, like where does a word come from, So the other thing you touched on, Richard, was beautiful, is pattern recognition. This is huge in McLuhan. You study the patterns, then you get a big comprehensive awareness. And that's why I'm so honored to have you all here, is because you're all pattern recognizers in Joyce deeply. And you do know the big picture of Joyce in a lot of ways. So Roy, chip at it away. How many of these 5 prompts you want to jump on?
I can only hold 3 things in my head at one time. Yeah.
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
That I love that Derrida quote. I think he said it was a 1,000th generation computer, and you can't say anything that was not pre-programmed into the. Which means he kind of went through all the permutations of meaning, which is different from being hooked into cosmic consciousness, where you see the past, the present, and the future all at the same time, which I like to believe every once in a while, maybe when I am stoned or something. But like when he talks about John and his Yoko hat, I thought, wow, he really saw, of course, John and Yoko Ono. I don't think so, but But yeah, but you said that you thought the wake had no content, right? So that means it doesn't have any form either. If form is an extension of content.
Well, that's a very good question, Roy. You're asking me a question. I wouldn't want to ruin it with an answer, but that's beautiful because yeah, that's one of my favorite moments in studying the wake with Peter's group in Austin was saying that the wake has no content, and like a half a year later, Sherrie goes, "Jerry, aren't you going to tell us the wake has no content?" I mean, it's evident. It's evident that the wake has lots of content, but if you press something to an extreme, it might flip into its opposite, and you might have an epiphany. But yeah, I think it's interesting with Creeley's quote: "Form is never more than an extension of content." I mean, if you just drop the nevermore part, just is form an extension of content?
Yeah. Well, I like the discussion in the library where AE says art is supposed to connect us to formless spiritual essences, like Shakespeare, Shelley, and I get the feeling that Stephen doesn't like that. He comes out with his dagger definitions in response to that. That I think as an Aquinian, Aristotelian, he believes in informed content rather than formless essence. Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think I heard I once heard Richard Ellman say this that in D.H. Lawrence there is form in the passion, and in Joyce there's passion in the form. I always like that.
That is good. And Roy, what's your take on what's the difference between conscious and consciousness?
What's the difference between being and beingness?
You're like Irish people; they answer questions with questions. Okay, go ahead. You want to try?
Why do you hang around with that sadist? Beats me. I don't know.
Now, before we go to Peter and Duncan, Patrick, were you raising your hand? Did you want to make a point?
I just want to throw out one phrase.
Please.
Finnegans Wake is a pile of litter.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of what it literally is.
Yeah.
But I might want to go back to your consciousness thing, but
yeah. But who said that pile of litter quote? Is that?
Well, it's in, I forget which numbered section it is, but it's in the first, 100 pages or so of Finnegans Wake, where you have the Mama Festa, the hen picking in the pile of litter. It's kind of a figure for the whole work, in a way.
Yeah.
And also it's a way of reading Finnegans Wake, because in a way you can't really plot it, but you can. But so we all kind of pick through the litter, and then construct various, shapes that you can call forms, I guess, out of it.
Yeah, we picked through the litter. I literally dumpster dove a book that explained Finnegans Wake, and it's like you can go to the library, you can go to big archives in Texas, you can go to the internet, or you can go to a garbage can and learn about Finnegans Wake. Who knows? Okay, Peter, you're go ahead, Roy, and then Peter.
I was just going to add on to that. I mean, there's a great line, the litter, the letter, the sooner, the better, which is based on, deliver the letter, the sooner, the better. So that brings in the whole idea of the postal effect and the message that's never quite delivered or is always in transit.
And that line eventually got in Phil Spector's song, right?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Because of cosmic consciousness.
Okay, Peter Quandrino's my hero. He insisted this wasn't going to be all white dudes and said, "I'll only come if you have women." So thank God Maddy and Sherrie showed up. And Peter, do you got the quotes, or you want me to give all 5 prompts again?
I mean, I'll just say a couple of things based on what I've been hearing. So one thing I'm thinking of with regards to form and content, Hugh Kenner came up with this term, the Uncle Charles principle, because in Portrait, whenever Joyce is talking about Uncle Charles, the prose kind of changes to reflect the way Uncle Charles would speak or the way he would think, his inner monologue. And that's what Joyce carried on all throughout all of his novels is, whatever the content is, that kind of dictates the form. And then in Finnegans Wake, where it's a dream, obviously the form is crazier than any other of Joyce's books. But also in the Wake, there is some kind of chronology where in the beginning, the sleeper has just fallen asleep. I mean, I'm not saying this definitively. I'm saying like supposedly. In the beginning, the prose might actually be a little easier. And then towards the middle of the book, when you're in the deepest part of the dream, that's when it gets a lot denser and harder to follow and figure out. And then towards the end, it starts to clear up a little bit because the person's almost waking up and their rational daytime consciousness is coming back. So that's one thing about form and content. And the other thing is, well, I guess it's also related to form and content, but I've just been thinking of like the materiality of the text, like the way letters actually look on the page in Finnegans Wake, versus the commonly expressed way to read the Wake, which is out loud, which is certainly a wonderful way to approach the book, and you'll get a lot out of it that way, and things might become a little more clear reading it out loud and hearing it. But there are aspects of the text that you actually have to see that can't really be expressed out loud. I think Joyce is all throughout the Wake, he's just constantly focused on like I don't know what the word is, like equivocality, I guess, like equivocating, kind of like constantly showing the middle ground between opposites and how opposites unite and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, he does that with sound and sight, with text on a page and text heard aloud as well.
Peter, brilliant. That's totally Frank Zappa. He taught me to embrace contradiction with the great Zen line, nothing is what I want. And so, I want to stay on you before we go on Duncan for a second, because, Maddy helped me break down this McLuhan quote well, because is there a difference between art and technology? And I would say art is content and technology is the form. And he said art is the collective unconsciousness and technology is the collective unconscious. Peter, what's your take? What's the difference between conscious and consciousness?
Well, if we're talking about a collective unconscious, we're putting words on something that cannot be defined, right? But to me, consciousness is kind of like a verb, whereas conscious is kind of a noun. Consciousness, I know, Maddy. Yeah, I guess consciousness could be seen as more active. So it's like, the collective unconscious is dormant. It's there. It has some impact. It's available to be probed in some ways. But a collective unconsciousness kind of implies something more active, I think.
Beautiful, Peter. That's Bucky Fuller said, I seem to be a verb. And, the American Indians, indigenous in America, say they have no nouns. They only use verbs. And that was really good, because I think this comment that I haven't discussed with Duncan, and you're up next, Duncan, is amazing. As McLuhan said that Finnegans Wake is like he didn't say it is, he says it is like our contemporary consciousness of the unconscious. So it's amazing little twist. So Duncan, you want me to say all 5 prompts, or you want to just roll with it?
I keep on hearing the terms conscious and consciousness being bandied about, and I hear the terms content and form being bandied about. So let me just take a stab. So I'm conscious of the fact that I arrived early, but then when I saw that so many people were here, I became worried that I was late. Now, the only reason, so these are things that I'm conscious of.
Yeah.
I arrived early, I thought. All you people were already here. I became conscious of the worry on my part that, geez, maybe I'm late. Maybe I got the time wrong. Okay. So those are things that I'm conscious of. Now, the only way I can be conscious is if there's such a thing as consciousness. And that's about as far as I want to go with that. And in terms of form and content, it's like yin and yang. They're all mixed up together. If you want to go to a certain place on the continuum, you could say this is just content. To a certain place, this is just form. Now, I believe it was back in 1965 with a friend of mine, a stoner friend of mine, when we were smoking pot, and he was telling me he was an English major. He was very concerned about the difference between form and content. And I doubt if he's resolved it any better than I have. And I don't worry about it. There are terms, if I was an English teacher, I think I would probably have to figure out some practical definition, because I would be expected to do something in the class using the terms form and content. But as just a lay person who messes around with literature and likes to think, I don't have to get too serious about it. That's my answer.
That was beautiful. I'm like Zappa again. I'm very serious about being not serious. Sure. So I'm glad you're all here joining in that regard. And this is another person we invited who couldn't make it was Peter Crisp, who has an amazing, I don't know, what does he have, Peter, or Duncan, you guys know, is it an Instagram or a Facebook page about the wake?
Well, he's got a blog.
A blog, okay. Yeah. He has a blog. So he didn't come, but, it was a jumping off point for starting the salon was Bernadette Lowry has a new book about saying Piercy French is what the wake is all about. Okay, the songwriter. So here's what Peter wrote. I'm going to read you this line and we'll go round robin and get your reactions. Peter said that Bernadette Lowry's writing in a tradition of books which claims that Finnegans Wake is written in a code which can be broken with a single key. It's as if the book is an allegory in which everything stands for something else, as if Joyce spent 17 years hiding the meaning of his book. So I can form that into a question, or we can just go round robin. Any comment, Patrick?
Well, I guess I don't buy that at all. I mean, I think that's absurd. But getting back to this consciousness thing, I'm just thinking about it while we're sitting here talking. But it seems to me you could argue that conscious is, in a sense, a feeling that we associate with thought, which we can only express with words, But consciousness, like Finnegans Wake, is a material articulation of consciousness to some extent. I mean, it's printed pages or digital pages or whatever, that survives. But, part of my philosophy is that subtracting all the trivialities of our everyday lives, the things that what we think of as consciousness survives in a way, because while Joyce's body may be dead and gone, the traces of his consciousness are still with us. And how does one distinguish the traces from the original?
Yeah,
except that you subtract his personal feeling of being aware, in that sense. It's gone, but we substitute for that. We become aware. you know, when we engage with that text. And to
Beautiful.
me,
yeah.
Go
ahead.
No, the only thing when I was referring to the pile of litter, I mean, I think that, you know, Finnegans Wake, for me, the unconscious has to be completely material. And I'm not a Jungian. I am something of a Lacanian and a Freudian sometimes, but it's. I think there's all kinds of formal possibilities to Finnegans Wake, but I really think that it's kind of like trying to argue that when Jackson Pollock was throwing paint, that he knew exactly where everything was going. I mean, I think Joyce was thinking in the act of writing, and there was no distinction. There was no line. There was no like, I have a thought and now I'm going to write it in this particular format. Hence, forget the code thing. I think exactly what he wrote is what he had to write, you know, as he worked through it bit by bit. And he always said he could explain or justify every line, which I remain dubious about. Simply because having written a few things myself, I know how difficult that can actually be, especially after a certain amount of time has passed. But I think, you know, what we have is all surface. You know, what we would call the unconscious would be effects that even Joyce couldn't account for. It's kind of like as a teacher, you know, when you teach, I think that the most, sometimes you learn at a certain point that you had this effect, you know, as a teacher that you never intended or even thought of or even aware of. And I've come to the conclusion sometimes that when you teach, your most profound effects are things of which you're completely unaware at the time, but they're implicit in what you were doing. You simply didn't realize it, you know, or you had not that consciousness, that feeling of awareness. So anyway.
Beautiful, Patrick. So many great things. The first thing I would quote the great Paul Krasner: I only believe in reincarnation in one of my past lives. So this is like, you know, Joyce will live forever. He forgot to die. Joyce will never die. He forgot to die. And the other thing is back to feeling and thought. You know, I've interviewed all of you individually, and I say, are humans more feeling beings or more thinking beings? And I go, this is a stupid question because it's both, of course, and it depends. But 90% of people say, well, we're more feeling beings. And you can't separate feeling from thought, but we think we can because we invented the words. So we want to say, well, I'm a neuroscientist. I can tell you when you're feeling something and when you're thinking something, or, you know, distinguish these two words and what they mean. But Sherrie, will go to you now. I mean, basically, Peter's saying this sort of facetious statement at the end of his quote, as if Joyce spent 17 years hiding the meaning of his book. I can read the whole quote if you want, or you can just jump off if you want on any idea.
I do remember what you said. Well, say the last thing again quickly. Sorry, I'm getting older.
That's all right. Just for everybody's sake. That's all right. For everybody's sake, I'll read it, because within this one line, there's, like Maddy says, there's like 4 prompts. This is what Peter said, that Bernadette Lowry's writing in a tradition of books that claim that Finnegans Wake is written in a code, which can be broken with a single key, as if the book is an allegory, as if Finnegans Wake is an allegory in which everything stands for something else, as if Joyce spent 17 years hiding the meaning of his book.
Bullshit.
Richard, you're supposed to raise your hand, but that's all right. I like how you put that in. Okay, Sherrie.
I mean, I have heard that a lot. You know, some people think it's all about fly fishing or something, but it could be about each of those things that people think it's about and everything else. But I don't think it can be broken with a single key. I just think I was reminded when you said that, because when we were meeting in person, before we started meeting on Zoom, every time we would come to a meeting, each one of us would show up with our 8 huge volumes that were supposed to make Finnegans Wake easier to understand, each of which was almost as difficult to understand as Finnegans Wake, like the Skeleton Key to Finnegans Wake and all of those books. And but I do think that it's it exists on so many different levels.
Yeah.
That you can just find all these patterns in it. And I do think that there is an overarching form to it all. I mean, I know some people say, oh, maybe he was schizophrenic or he's crazy, but there is an overarching, as a beautiful form to it, like a cathedral or something. So
that was beautiful. That's so good, Sherrie, because it is a statement I always slip in Dublin. I goes, well, McLuhan broke the Finnegans Wake code, and people roll their eyes. And I say it as an extreme statement in the tradition of Joyce saying his things, because saying there is no single code is the same thing as saying there is a code. You know, it's just rhetoric. So, Maddy, any comment on this Peter Criss quote about codes and whatnot?
All right, I gotta apologize here. Can I have the whole quote again? Because there are like 4 things in there, and I just need the word.
No, I like the as ifs. Peter Criss says that Bernadette Lowry's book on Percy French is writing in a tradition of books which claims that Finnegans Wake is written in a code, which can be broken with a single key. Now, we can just drop that word single, because we know it's not a single key, but which can be broken in a single key, as if the book is an allegory in which everything stands for something else, as if Joyce spent 17 years hiding the meaning of his book.
So I think if we were to crack the code, if there were such a thing to Finnegans Wake, we'd be cracking the code of like everyday life. And there is no singular everyday life. There's no singular Finnegans Wake. There's no singular key. But like if we can't figure out like the allegory or the code, if there were even such a thing, it's because we're probably not very good interpreters or engagers with our life and things around us.
That's good, Maddy, because that's Joyce saying finding epiphanies in everydayness. So you did that. Okay, Mr. Bullshit Richard, that was a great statement to start in. And but what are all those books behind you about?
Actually, all those books are about Finnegans Wake, and I'm not an expert on Finnegans Wake, but some of the things you've been saying like reminded me of things, so I pulled the book off my shelf. Yeah. And to borrow somebody else's terms, let me quote like 2 or 3 sentences written by Samuel Beckett.
Nice.
And he's talking about Finnegans Wake. And he says in his essay on Vico Joyce, which was in his examination at the beginning, here he's talking about Finnegans Wake. Here form is content. Content is form. You complain this stuff is not written in English. It is not written at all. It is not to be read, or rather, it is not only to be read, it is to be looked at and listened to. His writing is not, and in italics, almost something. It is that something itself. So that quote that you provided in which, it's about something else, it's not about something else. It is the thing itself. I agree with Beckett.
Yeah. No, I love Beckett too, because I've had it out with Zizek. He's a Beckett guy and I'm a Joyce guy. Of course, I love Beckett, but I think they're not, one's better than the other. But we in talk about Patrick, Zizek's the foremost Marxian, Lacanian Marxist of the world, and he goes Beckett instead of Joyce. But that was brilliant. But I want to go back to Patrick's statement and what you said, Richard. It was not written at all. And the beauty is that Patrick says it is material. It is written so that we know Finnegans Wake does exist as a book, but in our context, it exists as a living organism because it joins us together in Zoom and we stare at each other and have a good time. Okay, Maddy, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to bring this up when Peter was talking about materiality and like kind of the tension between the written and the spoken. All of this talk about form. Form is in a lot of ways something that really only exists like on a page and in a material context. Like, of course, like there's, you know, formal dimensions to poetry, which is an inherently kind of oral genre, but that's one of the things that the Wake is trying to like upend is like it does exist materially, but that's not the only place it exists. And like all of this talk about form and content, it's like the form is both in it and outside of it. It's like on the page and beyond it. So like, how are we supposed to talk about form if we're only staring at the page? And how could we talk about form if we're only listening?
Yeah. It's good, Maddy. Okay.
We're supposed to do too.
Very good. So Roy, you're up.
Yeah, I think Lawrence of Arabia said nothing is written. But I don't think that applies to the Wake. I mean, I think I know there's that line in the Wake for the greater glossary of code, where I think Joyce is making fun of the idea that there could be some kind of code that could be cracked, and then you would have the meaning without any effort. But he, I think one thing about things are I think a lot of things in the Wake are semi-formed, and they want to interact with the reader. I think Joyce at one point called them active elements that at a future date will fuse together, and I think that allows the reader to participate in the process of formation rather than finding some content or some form that is definitive in any of his games.
Well, that's McLuhan updating mid-career. Medium is the message, medium is the massage. To the fore, the user is the content. So we're the content of the Wake when we read it out loud with a group of people and talk about it. Then we're the content. That's why I say it's no difference. We could read People magazine instead of the Wake and be the same thing. It would be a bunch of people talking about, words.
This critical apparatus on the New York Post, we could probably come up with that.
Yeah, the New York Post. I'd do that over the People magazine. But it's also what you said, Roy. I would in really consider that. What does Joyce end with? The keys are given. What does he say? The key is given, or what is it, Peter? Plural, key, or keys?
Single.
The keys too.
The keys too are. I'm giving you the keys to this book right here. He's telling you he's giving it.
So remember, in a portrait, Stephen refuses the keys that are given to him by the to become a priest, the power to bind and loose.
Well, my favorite. That's good. My favorite is Hafiz, the Persian poet, has this poem about you drop the keys in front of the jail cell door so the prisoner can just reach through the bars, pick up the key, and release himself. And that's the key. There's the keys are given. Like we're in Joyce's jail cell, like Sunra says. Everybody's in jail, but my jail's the best jail. And so we're all in the Joyce jail, and he's dropped the keys so we can just pick it up and release ourselves. Okay, Peter and Duncan, but first, Sherrie, go ahead.
This is just brief, but about in reference to the keys, because a theme throughout the book, and there's many references to it, is to the opera Arna Pogue, where she gives her husband the keys to the prison cell in a kiss. She kisses him and gives him the key with her kiss. So that's what I thought of on the last page when I read that, or that's one of the things I thought of.
Yeah, and one of the things I love that Joyce does with the Wake is he not only packs all this meaning into these portmanteau words that he makes up, where he's combining syllables from different words, mixing them together to try to drag in all their meanings. But also like an everyday word that he's spelling normally, like keys. Within the wake, it has new resonances and new potential meanings. Like keys could actually be kiss or keys,
Mm-hmm.
and also keys, Quay, the Dublin Keys on the side of the river.
Mm.
There's this whole theme in the book about riverbanks, and riverbanks kind of embodying opposites, and actually yin and yang originated as describing the opposite ends of a river.
No, really.
Wow. That was brilliant. Thank you, Sherrie, for that. That's exactly why I stage these salons, so I can learn something new, and I want to know more about that opera. So, Peter, you're up. You do this. Like, Peter Criss's blog, and you know what he's saying here. As if Joyce spent 17 years hiding meaning in his book. I mean, I'm really curious, Peter Quandrino, because that's what we do, don't we? Aren't we these safe crackers, and we're trying to turn and listen to the ball bearings so we can, break open?
Yeah, I mean, of course he was concealing meanings. I mean, every word is concealing meanings. And even when he would send a manuscript or something to his patron and try to explain, this is referring to this is referring to this, he's still only giving you, a small percentage of the actual information he's packing into those lines. Yeah. So he, that's the whole point of this, is to overload as much meaning in there as you can. And by doing so, obviously it's concealing a vast majority of the information that's in there. But yeah, there is I guess the word he said was tradition. There are a lot of these studies of the wake where they're saying it's all about this one theme. This is the key to unlock the whole book. And I've read some of them, and what I love about those kind of books is when you're reading them, you become completely convinced, and you're kind of enthralled by all this evidence and all these ideas, and then you can pick up the wake and start reading it and see exactly whatever that theory is. Like I've had that happen. Like when I read John Bishop's book, and his whole theory that it's all a sleeping body, like actual flesh. I read the wake after that, and I see everything in there aligns with what Bishop is saying. Or Benjamin Boyson, Jerry, who you interviewed, his amazing book, The Ethics of Love, which has some crossover, I think, with Bishop. But same thing, I read that, and then I would look at the wake, and every part of the wake, I'd see it through that lens,
Yeah, hold on, Richard, 1 second. I just want to say, Peter, that was brilliant, because just a few years ago, like the Wall Street Urinal had this great article that seeing is believing has now been switched to believing is seeing.
Yeah,
that once you believe something, then you will see it.
Yeah.
So, Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on what Peter, I guess, was saying, in that I'm curious to know what each one of the people participating here finds the best book that they've read about Finnegans Wake.
Yeah, that's good. We'll do that round robin after Duncan comes up. That's a great comment, because just to go off on Peter for a second, Peter Criss also put in his email to me that Grace Eckley's book, Steadfast Wake and Encryptions, she thought the key was journalist W.T. Steed. Is that how you say his name, Steed?
Yeah, and there's another one. I think it's
Martha Black, Shaw and Joyce. She claims that George Bernard Shaw. So I mean, it's endless. I mean,
there's a book that the title is something like The Wake Lock Picked.
Yeah.
And that whole theory is that it's all the book of Genesis, right?
Yeah. And Sherrie, hold on, boy, for a second. And Sherrie, many of us know that article in the New York Times years ago that said it's all about salmon and salmon fishing. And the guy you know. So go ahead, Roy. You were going to say something.
No, I saw Black. What's her first name? Yeah,
her name is Martha Fodaski Black.
Actually, I mean, I think it's a really good book. But I remember seeing her lecture, and one of her arguments was that Shaw called, I think, Back to Methuselah, or one of his work in progress, and Joyce called it work in progress, and this proves that that Shaw is behind everything that Joyce wrote in Finnegans Wake, which seemed a bit screwy to me at the time.
Hey, I found Ted Nugent in the Wake once, and he wrote a book called Ted White and Blue.
Grill it. Yeah.
Go ahead, Peter, and then Duncan.
I think any theory that is saying there's some hidden resource that Joyce was following the whole time that he was, not revealing it. I mean, obviously, I'm sure the new book makes a good argument about Percy French, and I'd like to read it and everything. But I just think the idea that he maintained some source for 17 years and kept coming back to it without ever telling anybody, I just find that really hard to believe.
Yeah, no, his source. You mean Joyce?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, well, he did say, he says, how'd you write Finnegans Wake? He says, I didn't write it. The people over there at the coffee house wrote it. They're Starbucks. Okay, Duncan, you're up. You want to comment on this Peter Chris thing?
Well, make some comments. What would you like me to comment on?
Just, you're my guru, and it's your mantra. It's multiple. It's like Robert Anton Wilson. It's like playing chess on 4 different boards, and you got to jump the levels. So I think you're multiplicity, but you do a lot of research. And go ahead.
I have a lot of books. I've discovered a lot of keys, and been temporarily enthralled with them. I finally realized that this is like, go any morning, go on the internet and just think, how many keys are being offered to me? Whether they're an actual advertisement, of some sort, get rich, get smart, get the girls, get the boys, become a genius. We're always offering keys, and part of what Finnegans Wake was a comment on modern consumer society. So that's one thing. Joyce did spend 17 years hiding stuff, and he did it for a very practical reason. I'm reading McCourt's book right now with a group of people, Consuming Joyce, 100 Years of Joyce in Ireland, which is, it's a very academic book. I think it's a very good book. The number of quotable quotes is incredible, but I began to realize a couple of things. I'm also doing a lot of readings and rereadings of Ulysses. And, he after a while, when he released Ulysses, my opinion is, he realized that he was printing really explosive stuff. And there were real reasons for people in the church and the government and, traditionalists in literature to be really pissed off at him. He's not an innocent angel. He's deliberately going out to fuck with them. And he realized, Ulysses is a great book. I'll read it over and over again. But he also realized that, well, maybe that's not the smartest way to do things. Let's do something else, because I've got other stuff I want to play with, other stuff I want to reveal, and I don't want to spend all my time fighting these fuckers. So I'm going to hide it. I'm going to make it obscure. I'm going to make sure that the people who come to it and stick with it are people who are rather open and are willing to consider the fact that, there are not only multiple interpretations of everything in the book, there's infinite interpretations and everything in the book, and that's the point of the book.
Yeah.
So that's my opinion, and I'm sticking with it for at least the next 5 minutes.
Richard, start your top watch on Duncan right now, because, back to what Sherrie said, evoking the symbolist. Mallarmé said, don't paint the thing itself, paint the effect it produces. So I loved your question, Richard. And so let's go briefly around. We don't have to explain the book, and I'll just refine the question a little. What's the book you would recommend right now to someone that sort of concerns Finnegans Wake? And I'll start, and I'll cheat, and I'll put 3. I'd say War and Peace in the Global Village by McLuhan, because it has pictures. You don't have to read it. And then I would say Take Today, The Executive is Dropout, because it's McLuhan's best book and it's unreadable. And it definitely has some amazing things about the Wake. But really, Richard, the way I'd answer your question is Ulysses, because I never read any Joyce until Finnegans Wake, and I got a heavy bias. And now Duncan and I are running a Ulysses reading group, and I know that I'm learning a lot about the Wake, but my bias is the Wake's way better than Ulysses, and that just shows to go So, Duncan, which one book you'd recommend concerning the Wake to another person right now?
Join the group.
Join a Finnegans Wake group. Forget a book. Okay, Peter, you're the master at chalking off $40 books to Amazon. What would you say? Just one right off the top of your head.
Well, I wouldn't even say like a scholarly work about Joyce. I would actually recommend something only tangentially related, which is there's some novels I think that really kind of inform the Wake, or kind of they could spark people's interest in the Wake. Because in order to read Joyce, in order to read the Wake, you just have to be really interested in it to sustain that process of going through the slog, But anyway, I would say there's a book called Reader's Block by David Markson. Markson wrote 4 books where it's all just these short lines, and it's all like facts about artists and historical figures and how these people died and all these things. But he keeps mixing in things from Finnegans Wake, references to the Wake, or he says, this is my Finnegans Wake. And the reason I recommend that is because it's like what Patrick was mentioned earlier. It's this idea of all of history is a garbage dump. It's a litter. It's just piles of crap that you could sift through and piece together and see what you come up with.
Beautiful. Thanks, Peter. Roy, you're up.
I like McHugh, but that's not written by him, because he doesn't intrude too much. He just gives you the little snippets of references. I find it useful, and Glasheen, but I like a Clive Hart book on structure and motif.
Good. That's 3 good ones. Roland McHugh. When I started my Wake group, there was no internet, and I had Roland McHugh Xerox, so I didn't have to lug the heavy book every meeting. So those were 3 great ones. Okay, Richard.
Well, my favorite has always been Margot Norris's Decentered Universe of Finnegans Wake.
Yeah,
I think is a brilliant analysis of the psychological aspects of the novel. But if I were to recommend to somebody a book that would have even greater value than just Finnegans Wake, but is heavy on Finnegans Wake, it would be the 3rd volume of Joseph Campbell's Masks of God, which is called Creative Mythology, which is absolutely filled with Finnegans Wake quotes. And I think it's the best thing Campbell ever wrote.
Really good, Richard. That's super cool, because most people don't know Joseph Campbell got more famous than his wife because of him being on Bill Moyers. And those tapes are worth watching, or they're very important. But there's a whole series that I have on DVD. It's like 6 hours of Campbell just talking about Joyce.
Yeah, it's called Wings of Art.
Yeah,
I'm a book dealer, and I recently sold those DVDs to a Joyce museum that's opening in Buffalo.
Super cool, dude. Okay, Maddy, you're up. What would you recommend?
All right. So, in all honesty, I really don't read scholarly or popular things about the Wake. Like, in total, I've read maybe 5 books, and that's because I've read maybe like a quarter of like 15 or 20 books, but I've never finished them because that's not how I like engaging with the Wake. So I agree with Peter that reading fiction, reading poetry, things that Joyce would have been acquainted with, or maybe things that came afterward and that maybe engage with the Wake I think are more, for me and how I like to read the Wake, more useful. But the thing that I think I would recommend for people to read to really get a sense of what the ethos of Finnegans Wake is about is Thomas Carlyle's Sartor Resartus.
Oh, wow.
It's about this guy who's reviewing a book about fashion, and it's silly and it's stupid and it's like, it's just so gloriously wonderful. And I think a lot of kind of the humor and thematics of the Wake you can see in Sartor Resartus. So that's what I would recommend.
Super cool, Maddy. Thank you. Sherrie, you're up.
Okay. I agree with Maddy that like every book I ever read in my whole life prepared me to read Finnegans Wake. I'm glad I came to it a bit later in life but I would say I had to narrow it down, but okay. So The Golden Bough by Fraser, Francis Balderoff's book, Hermes to his son Thoth, which seems kind of like crazy because why is Hermes the father and Thoth the son? But that's the title. Donald Vereen's book, The Philosophers at Finnegans Wake. Maddy knows Donald Vereen. And The Egyptian Book of the Dead.
That is really good, Sherrie. Thank you so much. Okay, Patrick, any titles or any comment?
Well, I guess I'll break the rhythm and actually refer to an academic book. My favorite book on Finnegans Wake, although I haven't read in a long time, but then I haven't written on Finnegans Wake in a long time, is Bernie Binstock's Joyce Against Wake, which goes way back. But in my view, it's actually one of the most groundbreaking books, and it was less reductive than John Bishop, for example, but was rich in possible readings, and that's how I regard all readings of Finnegans Wake, is just possible readings. So that's the one I would recommend if someone were curious for a scholarly perspective, because that's what it is.
Super cool. Thank you, Patrick. And, I sort of dominated this, and I apologize because I asked you all to bring a quote and a question, but maybe some of you aren't so gung-ho on doing that. I know Maddy has one that she wants to propose towards the end. So before I go into my other 2 or 3 questions, does anybody else have a line from the Wake they want to read and or a round robin question or comment we could do? Go ahead, Richard.
I have a quote from the Wake. It's at 309, line 21-22. It's woman formed mobile and man made static.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always been interested in Joyce's treatment of women in particular. In fact, for this, since I'm not a Finnegans Wake person, I reread Sheldon Brivick's Joyce's Waking Women, which is a really excellent text. And I like the idea that Joyce was dealing with opposites, and the male-female thing is something that runs throughout all of his works. And so I've been writing about how Joyce treats women, or his interpretation of women in his works. And as Brivick points out, an interesting aspect of Finnegans Wake, and also related to his other works, is that Finnegans Wake begins and ends with a woman, the river. And Joyce seemingly saw the female attribute as being the source of resurrection, reinvigoration, reincarnation. And I think that runs throughout his works. I mean, I recently published something on the dead, in which I argue that the dead is really about reincarnation and resurrection, and that the whole idea of Greta's remembering the young boy who she loved when she was young, was a rendition, obviously, of the Christian myth about resurrection and reincarnation. So I think Finnegans Wake is obviously Finnegans Wake. It's Finnegans Wake. It's a major theme is certainly reincarnation, resurrection.
Yeah, go ahead. We could just go round robin with comments. So Roy, we'll start with you and then go round.
Yeah, well, I was also reading a Brivick's book, so and I wanted to connect that to something in the way. But he at one point he says all attempts to distinguish women's language from men's return to the same Joycean flowing features. So the idea of flow being characteristically female, as opposed to static, which is stationary. But the line I had was why way away? I so silly to be flowing, but I know kind of stay. Italian inflection. I'm not sure why, but yeah, the idea that they can't stay in a stationary. The flow does not stay in a stationary spot, but it's also a play on ha 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 he little brown jug, don't I love thee? So I think that implies that Joyce maybe was able to experience feminine flow through alcoholism, or through the love of liquor.
Really good, Roy. Yeah, and it's funny because that was one of the round robin questions I wanted to ask, and we can think about it is, does the mind more give birth to consciousness or create consciousness? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're detecting it, or do we actually give birth to consciousness? So any comment, Peter, on what Richard was bringing up and Roy continued with?
Well, okay. So what I was going to share is I have a quote. It's not directly from the Wake. I think it will connect to what Roy and Richard were just sharing, but it's from Jacques Derrida. I just recently read his biography by Peter Salmon, which was very good. And there's a few really good quotes about the Wake in there that I thought really articulated the appeal and what Joyce's project is. He says, the endeavor of Joyce is to repeat and take responsibility for all equivocation itself, utilizing a language that could equalize the greatest possible synchrony with the greatest potential for buried, accumulated, and interwoven intentions within each linguistic atom, each vocable, each word, each simple proposition, in all worldly cultures and their most ingenious forms: mythology, religion, sciences, art, literature, politics, philosophy, and so forth. And then just one last thing I want to mention. So there's this idea that I've been thinking of for a while, mainly from reading The Wake and from reading Bishop, which I've never really seen anywhere else until just recently. I'll talk about that in a sec. But the idea is that your body, your DNA, contains the entire history of the human species and even life before humanity. Because there's an unbroken line from the earliest amoeba to the earliest man to your most far distant ancestors. There has to be an unbroken line, or else you wouldn't exist, or else none of those ancestors would exist. And Joyce's, or what Bishop implies Joyce is doing in The Wake, is showing that all this history is actually in your body. It's in your bloodstream. Your bloodstream has been passed over and over again from ancestor to ancestor, so it carries all this information that when you're awake, you don't really think about, but when you're just an unconscious body, you're living inside of that history. You are that history. And the last thing I want to say is I just read a book called Trip by Tao Lin. It's about psychedelics and addiction and all this kind of stuff. Like can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, the sound went a little wonky, but just speak up a little maybe, and we can.
Sure.
There you go. That just cleaned it up perfect.
Okay, I think I had my copy of the Wake on top of my microphone here.
that was a perfect metaphor.
We heard the joy.
We were just lip reading you, dude, but that was amazing because you touched on something important. So go ahead at the end now. What were you going to say?
But yeah, there's the famous line from McLuhan that Finnegans Wake is like LSD on the page. It's like, you don't have to actually take drugs. You just read Finnegans Wake. So that book about psychedelics and everything, he kept talking about this idea of like actually experiencing and feeling this, unfathomable deep history that is in every cell of your body. So yeah, I think Tao Lin captured why Finnegans Wake is like LSD on the page.
And this guy's book is called Trip.
Yeah, TRIP.
Spell his last name.
LIN. His name is Tao, TAO Lin, LIN.
Great. Thank you, Peter.
Sure.
Duncan, you're up. Oh, you're on mute, Duncan.
I'm probably better when I'm on mute. Anyway, I love books. Okay. But as I get more experience in the world and as I get older and older, I will have to say that I think I share one thing in common with Joyce, which is words and books obscure. Okay. So, there's kind of two choices, in my opinion. And one choice is just to go very zen and learn to meditate and wipe the mind clear and observe things carefully. But I'm not really that kind of person. As I get older, I'm able to do that a little bit better. So the next best thing to clear my mind is have lots and lots and lots of books.
You're going to say drugs.
All kinds of contradictory points of view. That, I remember when I first entered University of Texas, and I took lots and lots of philosophy classes, and every time we studied a philosopher was like, oh my God, that's it. That's it. And then, of course, 4 weeks later, the professor would move on to another philosopher. And it would be, no, this is it. No, this is it. And I went through that many, many times, and I realized, oh my God, there are so many ways of looking at things. So I think Joyce, particularly in Finnegans Wake, is doing that to us. And he's taking words, and he's taking history, and he's taking points of view, and he's getting them all in there. And yes, we could spend many, many years, decades, etc. But eventually, he wants us to see what's behind the words and the sentences and the points of view.
Yeah,
that's it.
Good, Duncan.
That's all I'm going to say.
That's good, Duncan, because McLuhan has a great line. Understanding is not having a point of view. And before I go to Sherrie and Patrick, Maddy, I'm going to hold you off for a while until we get closer to the end, unless you want to go now. You want me to hold off, Maddy, till the end?
Remember, it's late at night for her.
I know.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, my thing is very much like a wrapping up.
Good. I'll do that because I'm going to do Sherrie and Patrick and then throw one in. Okay, Sherrie, did you want to bring up a line from the Wake or any round robin question or comment?
Well, I did have kind of a question. I'm going to introduce it. This is just some notes that I wrote, so it's not stated in a scholarly way, but what Joyce seems to be doing is showing us all the associations everywhere in the world, especially in Ireland, that relate geographically and historically to the myths and legends of all cultures. And my conclusion regarding the Viconian cycles is, even though we are in the most degraded part of the cycle, we can associate with the likes of Osiris by being aware that all time is happening at the same time. The heroes are still with us. Joyce has an irreverent take on all of this, but that's really the only way the material can be presented. It has to be all be a big joke, a stage set. And my question for the group, and this might be too big a question, I mean, for what is the mythic dimension in your own life that Finnegans Wake brings to mind for you? For me, it's like there's a book by Catherine Whitehorn called Cooking in a Bedsitter that takes place in London in the early 1960s. And so it's this sense of it's an artsy, she's in this small room, she's living an artsy life, she's just becoming a journalist. There's an angsty romance in the background going on that's always giving her fodder for writing about. And that's kind of like my mythic dimension of my life. I still live that way. I've lived that way since I was in college, and I still live like that. So that's my mythic dimension. But I'm just wondering if other people like recognize mythic dimensions in their own life.
Sherrie, that's a great question. Let's do that. But let me say that this is the wording you want. What's the mythic dimension in your life that resonates with the wake?
Yeah, that the wake sort of helped you realize.
The wake helped you realize, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Like, Leopold Bloom is just an ordinary citizen of Dublin, but he's also Ulysses. And HCE is just an ordinary citizen of Dublin, but he's also Osiris and Finn McCool and King Arthur and all the mythic heroes at the same time. So we all have those dimensions.
Yeah, I'll start off by answering Sherrie's question, because what resonates with me is what I learned from Frank Zappa, that all times are happening now. So, it's sort of like Ram Dass saying, be here now. It's like, yeah, you live in the present. And, Wyndham Lewis said, artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the future. It's like, yeah, it sounds good, but how do you live in the present by not, I've got to worry about tomorrow. I got to contemplate anticipatory mindfulness of what's going to happen tomorrow. What happened yesterday and how's it going to affect my tomorrowness? And I find that when I'm reading The Wake, I get lost in, there's no time. It is just like you're so present, listening to how each person pronunciates each syllable. I always say I'm good at The Wake because I got a good education. I know how to correctly mispronunciate. So this is like what Michael Silverblatt, who runs that radio show Bookworm, he's interviewed authors for years. He said, reading is better than living. He thinks reading is better than living his life. And, to me, Duncan was like, yeah, I like living a little better than reading, but I like reading. And then Silverblatt said a funny thing once. I asked him, what do you think of Finnegans Wake? He says, there's a typo in every word on purpose. So, Patrick, we'll go to you next about this question from Sherrie. What's the mythic dimension in your own life that the wake helped you realize?
I don't know. I don't think there is I don't think I would call it a myth. I mean, what I've been thinking about, can I just switch a little bit? Because
please.
For me, from teaching the wake and having written about the wake at some degree, and not having touched the wake since 2001, by the way, I should mention. In fact, to prepare for this, I reread some of the stuff I'd written just so I wouldn't come in here completely empty. And the thing is that has always struck me, is that the wake is a finite collection of letters that seems to have an infinite import. resonance, like echoing through time, so to speak. And when I was teaching the Wake, what always struck me was that I refused to accept the idea that the Wake was unreadable. Otherwise, why would I bother? But at the same time, I realized too that that the Wake shows you something about everything you've ever read, that you tend not to see, because when you're reading a novel by John Steinbeck or somebody, that's fairly straightforward, that you have this illusion, that there's a transparency, like you're looking through a window into something, But when you read the Wake, you realize that, okay, you get all of these ideas that are bubbling in your head, as you sort of unravel what little bit you can unravel as you proceed. And then you talk to someone else, and they have ideas. And so if you're in a seminar or something, you sort of exchange these things, or in a group like this, you sort of exchange these ideas. And then you go back to the text and you realize how different the experience of actually reading the Wake is from the experience of talking about it or writing about it. And so in a certain sense, every reading of the Wake fails, and but what I would argue, and this relates a little bit to what you said, Peter, is that Beckett has this term that has become almost a motto in my life, which is in a couple of his books, fail better. And to me, that's that's sort of my goal in life, is to try to fail better than my last failures, And so to me, the readings that, like John Bishop's book, for example, was, when I remember reading that years and years ago, and, I really got bored with it, frankly, because he goes off into so many esoteric territories that may or may not have really influenced Joyce that much. I mean, it was useful, in terms of like learning about the Book of the Dead and stuff like that. That was helpful. And I learned from reading it. But in the end, it was so, reductive and so forced, whereas I've read other books that simply, unpack things in it, find pathways through it. And some of them are better than others. And to me, that's important because, I mean, forgive me for the phrase, but like, is a fascist reading of Joyce possible? And I don't think it is, frankly. But of course, anything's possible. The question is, would anyone buy it? Would anyone find any interest in it? Would it have any, purchase on the actual thing? And I mean, in my own writing about Joyce, I know there are people, for example, who don't particularly like what I've written about Joyce because I tend to be a Marxist and a leftist. But I'm not I don't think I'm a very doctrinaire version of that. And so I don't think what I wrote was particularly reductive. And I never argued, for example, that Joyce was a Marxist, since that would be sort of ridiculous. But like the commodious vicus of recirculation at the very beginning of the text, I kind of related to the whole notion of commodity culture, capitalism, and the idea that Joyce spent all those years, I can't remember how many, 17, 8, whatever, writing the Wake, writing a book that everyone, just about everyone, not everyone, but just about everybody was telling him, including Ezra Pound, for example, this ain't working, man. We can't make any sense out of this. And it really struck me at one point that here was a guy who had already written a book that was difficult. And even though we think of it as the most successful book of the 20th century in some ways, remember that he had to go basically to what you might even call a vanity press to get it published. He had to go with his friends, basically. Like D.H. Lawrence did when he published Lady Chatterley's Lover. And then he wrote a book. He could have written all kinds of books in theory. Maybe he could, maybe he couldn't have, I don't know. That might have been what they call saleable. But instead he wrote a book that would be, would finally have a reputation and a readership. But who really reads Finnegans Wake? How many people have really devoted themselves to that process? I mean, I gave it about 13 or 14 years. And then I said, enough. I've had enough. And he did that for a reason, I think. I'm not saying he thought this reason. I don't know if he really thought it consciously, to use that phrase. But it seemed to me implicit that he was not going to give the world necessarily what the world wanted. You know, that he was not going to write another literary commodity, you know, whether it be pop literature or something, or, you know, I mean, Virginia Woolf and Rebecca West thought he was vulgar. And workman, like as if he was from the working class, which of course he wasn't exactly. But so to me, that is part of the essence of the work. You know, it's not a key; it doesn't unlock everything. And to me, the readings that matter are the ones that are interested in make sense, but also don't exclude every other possibility. You know, and seem to recognize what I think is important, which is the politics of Joyce's writing, you know, which is not, you know, he's not exactly a communist, except in the sense that communism may be Joyce, even though Joyce may not be a communist. The real communism may be more along the lines of Joyce's essence, you know, than what passed for communism in the 20th century, you know, in China or Russia or whatever.
Right.
Anyway, I'm sorry.
No, Patrick, there was so much there. That's enough for another salon with this group. Is it possible to do a fascist reading of James Joyce? That would really rock this. We're not a bunch of yes men kissing up to each other, because what you evoked to me was, or yes, human, sorry, is Samuel Johnson's great quote. No human but a blockhead ever wrote except for money. but I loved your thing on failure is brilliant, because I just performed at a Zappa concert the other day, and I said, repeat after me. This is Frank's maxim. I'm a failure, but I'm not a miserable failure. And that's so much resonates with Beckett. You know, Beckett's saying, hey, failing's human. And if you fail, you know, you can fail better. So onward and upward. Roy, what mythical dimensions in your own life did the wake help you realize?
Well, I kind of like the Daedalus Icarian thing. What goes up must come down, but also what goes down must come up. You know, it seems like he has. There are countless things. You know, starting with, or it doesn't start with, but you know, like Stephen feels his body uniting with the realm of spirit, and then the next thing you hear is, "Cripes, I'm drowned. I'm drowned." You know, they could just sent back to earth. But also, you know, he seems to be able to go to the absolute depths, and yet has a faith that things are going to turn upward and start the whole cycle again, no matter what happens.
So my wife says every night. Okay, Peter, you're up.
Yeah, as far as mythic dimensions, I mean, I don't know if I can give a perfect answer that will, you know, align with that, but what the wake has opened up for me is this great interest in poetry and just in words, like the potential of words, you know, from having much more than a utilitarian purpose. And I'm trying to think how best to explain this. Just like, you know, for those of us, I guess everybody in this call who spent time reading Finnegans Wake, you see in there, it's constantly, he's doing this thing like not yet, but very soon after, or not, like there's always this deferral, you know. I think part of that it's related to what happens in poetry, where it's like you're trying to put words onto something that there is no words for. You're trying to capture something that's not capturable. And so Finnegans Wake has just done that for me. It's just given me so much interest in how like words are such a tool, and you can't attach a word directly to a thing that you're trying to describe. It's impossible. And so I just love that play. I read that quote from Derrida earlier, and he uses the word asymptotic, And so I looked up that word because I didn't know what it means. And it's in mathematics. It's like a line. It's almost like two parallel lines that'll never meet. And it's the same thing with a word and its referent. It'll never actually touch the referent. It's always going to be sliding right above it or right near it, you know? So yeah, the Wake really created a great interest in that kind of, that aspect of language for me.
Beautiful, Peter. That's like all this press that T.S. Eliot's getting with the Wastelands 100-year, amazing stuff. And he said, when I talk to you, I got to use words. And we know that's not true, because a future salon we're going to do on the Wake is where no one can say anything out of their mouths. You can only use gestures and hold notes up to the camera. No spoken word. Okay, Richard, I know that what was the mythical dimension of your own life that the Wake helped you realize? I dumpster dove this book. How much is it worth?
Depends on the condition. I can't really tell.
Good condition, mint.
Yeah, you know, you can get a couple good bucks for it.
Couple good. It said inside it said $7.50.
Good price.
Good price for it. Okay, now you can answer the question, Richard.
Okay, maybe the best way for me to answer the effect that Finnegans Wake had on me that's of a mythic nature is that I was a vice president at a university, and I was conducting a job search, and one of the candidates came in, and the first thing she said to me was, "Oh, you're the Joyce scholar." So she had apparently read everything I had ever written about Joyce. And as we sort of developed a friendship, I later learned that when she took the train into Manhattan every day, she read all of Finnegans Wake on the train going in and coming out of New York City. And that's sort of the way that she wooed me. It was only later that I learned that prior to me, she had been married to the Joyce scholar Jerry Bruns. So I'm her second Joyce husband.
Wait, Richard, you ended up marrying this woman?
She's the greatest thing that ever happened to me. She's my editor. She's everything.
That's great.
I'm very lucky.
That is dimensional, dude. That is heavy. Thank you. Okay, Duncan, you're up.
As anybody who's worked in groups with me, you know that I have a lot of opinions and points of view. And I will sometimes argue vigorously for them, but that's all a fraud in the sense that they're just probes. And when I actually do feel guided by something, I like to think that it's Chuan Tzu or Huang Po. And I don't take my own opinions and points of view extremely seriously. God preserve me from rigidity. Although other people may see me as quite rigid sometimes. But I actually do feel like I've had a pretty successful life, mainly because I do feel guided. I will use logic and reason in books and all that stuff, but when push comes to shove, it's a feeling that I have is why I step in one direction rather than another direction. And I expect that I will continue that way. And I think that Finnegans Wake is a great aid in that regard. Joyce also was guided. I mean, one reason why Joyce could do what he did was because he, although Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot and some other people may have questioned Finnegans Wake over and over and over again, he still had plenty of support. And we're talking financial support. Why a spensterish woman with literary stuff who came out of a religious background, Harriet Weaver, why she supported him for all those years is one of the miracles, in my opinion. And Patrick wants to respond to that, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was a communist.
She was a
Yay!
communist. All right.
Hey, there's like,
I mean, and she, you know, she had inherited this wealth, and you know, he was working without a lot of income, so she gave it to him. I mean, she may have had that background, but that was her political commitment at that particular time.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
no, it's beautiful. In Duncan, it's like, isn't there like 5 women that had major, you know, support for, played major roles in Joyce's career?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. There's no doubt. Well, of course, there's Nora and there's Harriet and there's Sylvia and there's some others. Dora Marston, I think, was another big help to him.
Peggy Guggenheim.
And he was open. You know, he was a very stubborn fellow in some ways, but he was also very open at the same time. So he was a curious combination. And I'll stop here. That's it.
Great, Duncan. Thank you so much. So, Maddy, you want to answer the question, and then you can just morph into your question if you like.
Yeah, that's great. So the mythic dimension from Finnegans Wake that I think I've noticed in my life, there's actually a book that I'm reading right now that kind of hits on this very theme. I actually read it a couple months back, and I'm rereading it now because I'm about to teach it with a student. But the book is The Question of Red. And it's set in Indonesia during the 60s, time of a lot of like upheaval and political turmoil and religious turmoil, all sorts of stuff. And the story is about a woman named Amba, and she's kind of caught between 2 lovers. And it's a story that's directly out of the Mahabharata. So it's like a contemporary retelling of this mythic tale. And like one of the major themes of the novel is, can she kind of carve her own fate, or is she sort of destined to relive this sort of mythic dimension that her name would suggest? And there's a line in there somewhere that's something to the effect of, now I'm blanking on it. Now I'm supposed to talk about it. Oh, I remember it now. It's something like, the myths are always born out of the personal, and myths are built out of the everyday and personal experience. And it's sometimes hard when you're just living life. It's sometimes hard to not think about how the things that you're living are probably never the first time that anyone has lived that. And that's something that I just kind of think about just every day. I mean, interactions that you have, people connections you make. And especially when reading The Wake, it's like you notice all of these connections. And I think I've become highly attuned to what are essentially just like lovely coincidences that, take on mythic flavor or aroma, like because of experiences with The Wake. So that's kind of how I'd put that.
It's well done, Maddy, because that's the main thing I repeat of Joyce is find epiphanies in everydayness, And it's beautiful how you put it. Myths are born out of personal everydayness.
That's a paraphrasing of something in this book. I did not make that up.
Right. But I'm just saying, what's the author's last name on that book?
Pamuntjak. So Pamuntjak.
Yeah. Beautiful.
And the title is The Question of Red, like the color. And it is, speaking of politics, it's also about communism. It's basically love amongst the communists in 1960s Indonesia.
Love in the time of communists.
Well, that's why everything is .com. You know, my website is .laughters.com. That's because most people don't know the com stands for communism, because there's nothing more communistic than the internet. Look at how it's joined us from New York to Spain to Texas. This is into California. It's pretty amazing. We've all been here and you've hung in there. So, I can do one more question and then we can do your question, Maddy. I don't know if people want to hang for another 15 or 20, but you want me to do one more, Maddy, or you want to do yours now?
I think I'd like to go ahead and do mine now.
Go ahead.
And I actually think it's actually really interesting. I think a lot of the way that people approached Sherrie's question might be also applicable to my question. But they're different questions, but people might have similar answers. So my quote is on page 433, and I don't have a numbered edition, but it's down in the bottom fifth of the page. So page 433 at the bottom fifth. So the lines, I'll only start reading it because it goes on for a while. Never dip in the urn while you've browsers on your suite. Never slip the silver key through your gate of golden age. Collide with man, collude with money. Ere you sail, forget my prize. Where you trust, be circumspicious and look before you leak, dears. Never christen meddlered apples till a swithin is in sight. Wet your thistle where a weed is, and you'll rue it despinitas. And it goes on and on and on. For at least another paragraph, maybe even a full page. So my question is, this particular moment seems to be giving us advice and adages. And my question is, what advice have you picked up from Finnegans Wake?
Beautiful. That's good. Now we got to get down to it and be specific. Duncan, we'll start with you and reverse the round robin. Good question, Maddy, and great, beautiful quote. That's look before you leak. There's some good advice right there. Go ahead, Duncan, you're up.
Now, the question is practical stuff that I've learned from Finnegans Wake.
Or impractical. It doesn't really matter. You don't have to use the advice if you found it.
Okay, I'm kind of repeating myself again, but Finnegans Wake, among other things, has led me into studying rhetoric and paying more attention to words. So that's kind of practical stuff. And an impractical but delightful thing is I can really do some Wakean phrases and words and responses to friends of mine on Facebook. Where I can create words and phrases, and it's lots of fun. And to give a really stupid example, there was a woman on Twitter the other day who said, "So have you ever made up a word?" And so I had one that I've made up years ago. I said, "Yeah, my word is slover, which is a slavish lover." Okay, so that's not even a very good one, but I can do stuff like that, and I'm getting better and better at it because I'm learning that words are not only practical things, but they're also tricky and sometimes hide stuff from us, and they can also give us some good stuff for playing games. That's it.
Really good, Duncan. Yeah, it's taught me how to make up words too. I went to Google when it first started, and if you typed in a word, it would go, "Do you mean?" Oh, I think it still does that. When I typed in my own name, Jerry, it said, "Do you mean Jeremy?" And then I typed in my last name, and it says, "Do you mean Folkways?" So I've picked up this alias, as Roy taught me from Dylan. It's like Jeremy Folkways replaced my old alias, which was Geritol Fialka-Seltzer. So that's Maddy. I think we should add Duncan's addition. Peter, you're up. What advice have you learned from the Wake, practical and impractical?
There was a line in the Wake that I read years ago before I even read the book that kind of spoke to me. It was it's on page 451, and it's to funk is only Peter natural. Its daring fear is divine. Be bold. So, yeah, I just always took it as, it's normal to get down or get into a funk or whatever, but you have to dare your fears. Be bold. I've always tried to do that.
Peter, that is so with me because I think funk is the best genre of music, and I treat that differently. I treat the genre of music, funk, as a joyous thing rather than thinking it as most people think. I'm in a funk, I'm in a dark mood, in my shadow world. Mm-hmm. Thank you for bringing up that quote. I've used that on my band flyers for years. That very quote.
Cool.
Okay, Roy, you're up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of Shakespeare. I mean, we were talking before about, this is something they say in the library, that Shakespeare is the happy hunting ground for unbalanced minds. I feel like the Wake is kind of that for me. And yeah, I guess yeah, it's all about losing balance and regaining balance. But it is interesting that there's that one point in Ithaca where the narrator talks about Bloom reading Shakespeare and whether he did get any practical advice from Shakespeare, from reading him. No. Yeah. I mean, there's something about the question makes me nervous. I mean, I take this section. This is actually, I think this is Ron trying to seduce Issy with all of these. There's something behind it. All of this advice that he's giving her, and at one point in a portrait, he talks about all the different voices Stephen has, people telling him to be different things, be a good fellow, raise the fortunes of your family. Fight for the liberation of Ireland, all these different things. But he's more, that's not what he's about, is identifying any of those voices. He wants to kind of find the cracks to slip through them or something.
Slip to him. Don't sell out, sneak in. That was like the quote I wanted to say earlier when somebody was saying something. It was Paul Schrader, wrote Taxi Driver. He said, "The role of the artist is to attempt to sell out but fail." And so, Maddy, this is great because your question, quote, made Roy nervous. I want questions that make you nervous because, Maddy, I remember when I interviewed you, you went, "That's a trick question." I said, "Sorry, Maddy, all my questions are tricks." So thank you, Roy. Richard, you're up. And I want to thank you, Richard, personally, because you're sort of the reason we had this salon, because the interview with you went so well. I said, we got to do this with a group. So, the question, or you want me to repeat Maddy's question?
Could you repeat it?
Yeah, it goes like this. What advice did you, no, why don't you say it, Maddy? Should I say, what advice did you learn from the Wake? Is that it?
Sure.
Yeah. And then and I added practical and impractical.
Okay, well, the practical advice I learned from the wake is that I found some really good tape to hold together my copy of Finnegans Wake that has gone through so many different turns that it's virtually falling apart, but I've taped it back together again. That's about the best I could do.
Okay, that's practical. Now, was that impractical or practical?
That was practical.
Okay, now what's the impractical advice you learned from the wake?
I also learned not to use it as a doorstop because the door of my room was closing, and that's what was destroying the book.
Sacrilege.
That's back to commodity culture. Okay, Sherrie, you're up. Thank you, Richard.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess I don't know if this is exactly advice. I know it's inspired insatiable curiosity and sent me down, an infinite number of rabbit holes. But then I've ended up reading all these fascinating books in order to make some attempt to understand the wake. So I've read some great books and in that whole process. And I just wanted to, about this one, Maddy. I've said this to you before too, Jerry, because this is a quote from Donald Vereen. Occasionally we come across people claiming to have read all of Finnegans Wake. But one hears them as if listening to a rashy traveler return feverish from distant jungles, telling of a city built entirely of gold. That's how my friends, whenever they're like, "Oh, don't even ask her about that book. Don't get her started on it." I do sound like one of those rashy travelers. But I guess the practical advice is, when I was in Vancouver, I went to one meeting of their Finnegans Wake group, and we read a page that I'd never read before. Well, we read 3 pages I'd never read before. And some terrible things happened at the bottom of one of the pages. And then the very next line on the next page was "Hopey dope." So that's the, he's always, no matter how many terrible things happen, it is always that you're coming back to Finnegan begin again.
Hope. So. You mean hope, H-O-P-E. That's a good word.
Hopey dope.
Yeah. And Sherrie, you really evoked McLuhan's joke, the traveler or the explorers walking through the woods with his guide, and he realizes that they must be lost. And he turns to his Indian guide and he says, "I think we're lost." And the Indian goes, "We not lost, teepee lost." And that's like, hey, we're not lost. Finnegans Wake is lost. That's like you, Patrick. The wake is a failure. It's like, yeah, it's not a miserable failure, but it is a failure. Go ahead, Rob.
No, the story about the 2 aristocrats that are lost on the mountain. They're looking at a map. I guess this is the map is not the territory. I see where we are. See that mountain over there? We're right on top of it.
Well, that's like at the existentialist college. They have the map of the campus, and it says, "You are not here." Little arrow and an X. Okay, Patrick, you're up. What advice have you learned from the wake, practical and impractical?
Well, this is just what I've been thinking while listening to you guys, but I think something I actually believe, because I actually do believe some things. Mastery is the enemy of truth, and truth is an asymptotic process. Peter, that's for you.
Wow. Now, who said that, Patrick? That's you?
Nobody. I just made that up. But
just now?
What's the first word? I'm sorry, I missed the first word.
Yeah, say the whole quote again.
Okay. Well, I'm not quoting. I'm just I don't think I'm quoting. Mastery is the enemy of truth, and truth is an asymptotic process.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I mean from reading Joyce. That's particularly Finnegans Wake, because you can have the illusion of mastery with Ulysses, right? But with Finnegans Wake, you can't even have the illusion.
Right?
I can't.
Yeah, it's hard to master one page of Finnegans Wake.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Duncan. Beautiful.
I've been attempting. I've been reading Deleuze's book, Difference in Repetition.
Yeah.
Which I do not claim to entirely know, but what I think that Finnegans Wake is a really good example of we can all claim to be reading the same book, but we're not really reading the same book.
Yeah.
And then we are also, at the same time that we're reading it together, we're creating a book.
Yeah.
So, and I've started applying that in life too. I mean, that everything that I think is the same is never really the same.
Yeah. I like that.
It's a living organism. So that was good. So we'll close out really soon here. I just wanted to read this one thing from the gentleman who really got me into the Wake deeply, was Robert Dobbs, who is a McLuhan archivist. And he took the line from the Wake: television kills telephony in brothers broil. So right there, Dobbs said, you're naming two technologies. Our eyes demand their turn is the next line. Now the object is switched to biological forms. The eye, your eyes demand their turn. Let them be seen. So he's implying, Joyce is implying, let them, your eyes, be seen. Now, back to Dobbs saying, then the question is, what and who was to do the seeing? So Joyce was playing between art and science. And I love that, because I always try to figure out what's the difference between art and science, because the word jujitsu is etymologically based. The first part of the word jujitsu, which is this give and take, push and pull judo. Ju is soft and gentle, and jitsu is art and science. So I think that's a lot what the Wake is like a jujitsu, a judo, or you rise and you fall, you cry and you laugh tears. And so what you brought up, Patrick, with your quote, we'll do our last round robin question, unless anyone else has one, is in regards to that word truth. I'll set it up with two quotes that I love. Louis Buñuel says, I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it. It's a cute quote. Most 90% of people I say it to think it's right. Schopenhauer has a better one. All truth passes through three stages. First, it's ridiculed. Secondly, it's violently opposed. And thirdly, it's accepted as self-evident. I knew that all along. So it's a pretty easy question. 4 words. We'll start with you, Patrick. Is Finnegans Wake true?
Well, I would say the Finnegans Wake is a truth process, because I think that's what any significant artwork is, frankly. And but that's not the same thing as articulating some sort of a fixed proposition. What I would argue is that truth processes generate truthful propositions, or ideas. And but those truthful, when you say truthful, you mean they're truthful at that moment in that context.
Yeah.
They may not. The process continues. It can, and reading Finnegans Wake is a process, and Finnegans Wake is constructed like a process. And it's, you were referring to repetition and difference. I mean, that little phrase "sem anew," SEIM anew, that he uses. I mean, in a certain sense, the book ends with the voice of a woman. We take it to be a woman, and then it ends on an article, and then it begins with "river run." And I mean, it's at least arguable that the whole book is the voice of a woman written down by the sun. Although there's a moment when there's a passage where it refers to the woman writing, the schrites. She writes, SCHRITES, repeated over and over again. So I think it's a truth process, and
good, really good, Patrick. That was super. Okay, Sherrie, is Finnegans Wake true?
It's the truth of the landscape, the truth of the trees, the truth of the stones, the truth of the voices of the dead.
How cool. That was great. Maddy, you're up. You're up, Maddy. Is Finnegans Wake true?
Yeah, it's probably the truest thing that exists in the world, and most of the world is pretty fake. So, yeah.
Duh, that's a good word. Eric McLuhan taught me the word fake and the word fact both come from Latin to make. Okay, Richard, is Finnegans Wake true?
I think the idea that Finnegans Wake is true is a truism. It's self-evidently true.
Yes. Thank you, Roy.
I know that there's a line, putting truth and untruth together, a shot maybe had it, seeing what this hybrid actually was to look at. I think we're talking about Shem in there, but that goes along with the fact and fiction probably coming from the same root. But it does remind me, I always like the beginning of Winesburg, Ohio, where it talks about there are many truths, but as soon as somebody took one of the truths and made it the truth, then it became a falsehood, and they became grotesque as a result.
Yeah, Shelby Foote said something like, if you love a fact enough, it becomes the truth. But I always fuck that quote up, so I could be saying it wrong. Okay, Peter, is Finnegans Wake true?
There's a line in the book, today's truth, tomorrow's trend.
Good.
Dude,
I really like what Sherrie said. I'm with that as well.
Yeah, Sherrie, that trees line. Yeah, it's tree. But that's David Lee Roth, here today, gone later today. Really good, Peter. And Duncan, is Finnegans Wake true?
As a way. So Finnegans, imagine Finnegan going down the Liffey, creating a wake. And the method of which Finnegan is going down and is creating a way that we can follow. It's true in that regard. It's true in the sense of Chuang Tzu is true. It's true in the sense that Lao Tzu is true. For those who want to do it.
Yeah.
And there will be, of course, many more who will totally ignore the whole thing, and that's okay too.
Yeah, 22. It's 2 hours and 2 minutes, man. This has been immensely enlightening for me, and I'm so grateful to you all. And I hope we can do it again tomorrow and every day for the rest of our lives. But, I wanted to end, we started with this code, like I always say, Marshall broke the Finnegans Wake code. And just, Joyce invented the internet and disguised it as a book. And we all know that if you're young, like closer to Maddy or Peter's age, what do you do for a living now is you write code, dude. That's how you make a living. You're a code writer. So, I don't know if we are all going to become code writers or ever break the Finnegans Wake code, but we were code makers tonight. I think McLuhan says communication of the new is a miracle, but it's not impossible. And some of you know this joke. The priest is crossing over the Canadian border, and the custom officer says, "Excuse me, Father, what's in that flask?" And he opens up the flask and he says, "Oh, this is water." And the custom officer says, "Let me see that." And he takes a swig and he goes, "That's whiskey." And the priest goes, "It's a miracle." So, again, anybody have any other closing comments? I welcome them. Raise your hand. If not, we can just Go ahead, Peter.
I have a quote that I could share that I think kind of sums up a lot of what I've been saying and some of what we've been saying, and I think it really captures the wake and what Joyce is doing with the wake. But it's a quote from Stefan Mallarmé. It's a translation. So he says, "Such magisterial effort of the imagination, desirous not only of satisfying itself as a brilliant symbol in the spectacle of the world, but of establishing a link between these and the word charged with expressing them, grasping one of the sacred mysteries, or only the day when science, possessing the vast repertoire of idioms never spoken on earth, will write the history of the letters of the alphabet through all ages, and what was almost their absolute meaning, signification, sometimes guessed, sometimes misunderstood by men, creator of words."
Now you're saying that's Mallarmé, the poet?
Mallarmé.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, definitely send me that so I can circulate it to everybody. And your other quote that we couldn't hear clearly because you had the wake over your microphone, which was really appropriate, Peter.
That's a metaphor for something, I'm sure.
That was that. What is a metaphor? Okay, go ahead, Duncan. Yeah.
Okay, so going back to Maddy's question again, I would say that the single greatest benefit that the wake has brought me is I spend enormous amounts of time preparing for and interacting with other people interested in the wake. And it has led me into all kinds of consideration of language and attitudes. And I've discovered the joys of reading. It's taken me back. There's not that many translations of the wake into foreign languages, but it's taken me back to Ulysses. And I read on Saturdays. I read with some people from Brazil predominantly, a Portuguese translation of Ulysses. I've read a Italian translation of Ulysses, and I have prepared for other translations, and it's gotten me into reading Dante. So, and these are all meeting incredible people all along the way and sharing all kinds of information and emotion and experience. That's pretty fucking great, in my opinion.
Go ahead, Richard.
Just along those lines, I'd recommend to you John Cage's readings through Finnegans Wake, which are quite creative.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that was McLuhan. McLuhan called up John and said, do something about the wake. He
Right.
inspired him, you know.
Right.
Really?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Cage is great. I have nothing to say, and I'm saying it. That's like McLuhan saying, "Shut up," he said.
Right. Well, the thing that Richard is referring to, I mean, really, that book is incredible in the sense that Cage will, if you get it and you look at it, Cage will free you to literally play with the wake. And there's all kinds of little things that you can do, just going to a page and rearranging words, etc.
I don't know if people are familiar with Cage's music, but very briefly, a friend of mine was friends with John Cage, and they used to go out on mushroom forages, and they stayed at an old hotel in Vermont once, and the old radiators had water trapped in them, and they banged all night, and they kept her up all night, and she came down to breakfast next to Cage, and she said to him, "Did you hear that noise, that racket all night?" He said, "Yes, wasn't it beautiful?"
Well, you know, people can get into Cage's case all they want, just like Yoko Ono. And that recent article in the New Yorker on Yoko was amazing. In Cage, there's like 8 Cage documentaries you can get on Netflix, and he's pretty an amazing person. But you know, he charted on the English pop charts with his song 433, which is the silent piece where you sit at a piano and you don't touch the keys. I mean, that tells you something right there. If his music can chart, you know,
So they would play it for 4 minutes and 33 seconds over and over again.
I don't know what they played, but you can go to the Wikipedia page and it said it charted on the English pop charts, because there's been various versions over the years. But it's just the idea of it charting is almost more incredible than the
how can you cover that song?
Yeah. You will. It's easy.
How can you not cover that song?
Yeah. How can you not cover that song? Yeah, I've been practicing that song my whole life. Well, Thelonious Monk said silence is the loudest sound in the universe. So there you go. Boom. So anybody else have any closing comments? This could go on forever, but I really welcome them. So I'll tell you, Peter, the word you brought up there at the end was mystery. And Auden the poet said, the mystery of art is that we don't know it if it activates or pacifies us. So I'll tell you one thing, as much as I can think reading Finnegans Wake could put me to sleep, which is what Harry Smith said the purpose of cinema is to put you to sleep, is it's activated me. And this session with you people has really activated me and made me want to book more of them. And thank you all immensely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job, Jerry.
Yeah, and even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope this goes on forever and ever. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Yeah.